The Effects the Gilded Age Had on Ordinary People by Porter Matteson and Eileen Shu. So what was the Gilded Age, known more broadly as the Second Industrial Revolution? Well, it was part two of a century-and-a-half long era in human history, where people patented many new efficient technologies and discovered new ways to organize society. The first Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain, lasted from the 1760s to about the early 1800s, whereas the Gilded Age, the Second Industrial Revolution, was largely based in the US, began after the Civil War, and continued to about World War I. So here we'll peek into how ordinary citizens in the United States thought of these new changes that were revolutionizing their world in the Gilded Age. Alright, so what were the biggest of these changes? Well, in no special order, they could be classified as: number one, a gradual shift from an agrarian way of life to a society based on industrial production. Number two, a huge number of practical new inventions, some of which we see today, like railroads, cars, electric light, other electrical appliances like telephones, etc. And the electricity was very, very important to development during this time period. Number three, more concentrated wealth in the hands of a small elite, which in turn led to greater inequality, as seen by many people. And number four, a fresh, intense debate over the meaning of freedom. And we'll refer to all of these changes in the next slides. So, due to the shift from agriculture to industry, both cities and rural areas changed a lot. In cities, although the standard of living was higher than it had ever been due to the new technologies and factory-produced comforts, the quality of living wasn't so great in these large industrial parts of the country, and this aroused a lot of social tension. Well, what about agriculture? Well, for that, let's take Kansas Senator William PEFFER, who was a member of the Populist Party, a very influential third party at the time, by the way, because it advocated for farmers' rights. And in 1891, PEFFER criticized the prevailing economic system for favoring commerce and industry over independent agriculture and specialized trades, saying in a book that, quote, "In the earlier time, the American home was a free home, unencumbered, and whereas but a small amount of money was then needed for actual use in conducting the business of farming, there was always enough of it among the farmers to supply the demand. Now, when at least 10 times as much is needed, there is little or none to be obtained." End quote. Farmers were thus forced to participate in the new economy by selling their agricultural output. And for many farmers, this was hardly considered liberating. What about labor? The term Gilded Age is usually attributed to Mark Twain, the author and humorist. He pointed out that the late 19th century was a period where corruption and dirtiness abounded, under a thin layer of glamour, so-called progress, and Statue of Liberty style freedom and democracy. Where could this corruption be found? Well, factories and workplaces, for one, were home to glaring inequality. Corporate typhoons who managed these factories, nicknamed robber barons by those who hated them, tended to be extremely wealthy and did everything in their power to quench the formation of labor unions or wage hikes that would supposedly undermine their fortunes. In doing so, however, these typhoons undermined the workers' economic security. Eugene Debs was a locomotive fireman when he was a young man in the 1870s. He experienced the American labor movement in its full-fledged craziness, and it later led him to adopt the philosophy of socialism and become president of the American Railway Union. And Debs wrote once, "Through all these years I was nourished at Fountain Proletaire. I drank deeply of its waters, and every particle of my tissue became saturated with the spirit of the working class. I had fired an engine, and been stung by the exposure and hardship of the rail. I was with the boys in their weary watches, at the broken engine's side, and often helped to bear their bruised and bleeding bodies back to wife and child again. How could I but feel the burden of their wrongs? How the seed of agitation failed to take deep root in my heart? And that gives some taste of what the working class had to deal with. What about women's role in society? Well, during the first Industrial Revolution, the textile industry benefited from the numerous inventions created during the time, and clothing production changed from a traditional female role to a mass-produced factory system. But when the Gilded Age rolled around, many people were wanting more independence, and since part of that included the right to vote, many of these women became vigilant feminists eager to secure more freedom in their lives, including the right of suffrage. What about immigration? Well, a huge influx of immigrants arrived on American shores between 1877 and 1900. 7,348,000. That's a lot. And many people today know the hardship they endure just coming to America. But one letter from a Polish immigrant in 1891 gives some hint of what many thought upon getting a taste of life in the U.S. Part of it reads, "Here they select workers just as they pick out beasts at the market in the old country, or as they do for the army. Just as long as they are strong and healthy, that is how they deal with people. But it is true that if one is strong, young, healthy, and industrious, then he can make 100 rubles a month. But he also has to know how to speak American." Also, an important thing to remember is that Western and Central Europe, where most of these immigrants were coming from, was going through the same processes, mostly economically, that America was. This fact puts some perspective on the view that the U.S. was a special country that deserved to dominate others. So what can we conclude from all this information? Well, for starters, during the Gilded Age, economic insecurity was a way of life for thousands of people. People who stayed in commercial industry were often subjected to very dangerous working conditions, no pension, and low wages, although some were able to rise to a very high socioeconomic level, where they could control the economy and politics, arguably from a one-sided perspective. Next, since women entered the workforce to help support the family, they played an increasingly important role in the economy. Also, women in large numbers questioned the social status quo and began struggling for greater civil equality with men and independence. Next, trying to take advantage of the new economy, many people moved from the countryside to the city to seek better jobs and higher pay. But soon, many of these people found themselves trapped in unhappy, low-paying environments. Next, the big changes in America also attracted hordes of immigrants, mainly from Europe. Many who found that the country, although still a promising industrial center, was not a golden land that had the answers for everyone. Lastly, the Gilded Age ushered in a whole new idea of freedom. From a global perspective, the Second Industrial Revolution pushed the American economy a big step forward. Theoretically, a person could just work hard and become wealthy, but as we've seen, for most people it wasn't this simple. Many average American citizens suffered social, cultural, and economic inequality, and perhaps lost more freedom than they gained. And this was certainly true for those groups that we haven't covered: African Americans, Native Americans, Asian immigrants, and these groups suffered more discrimination than anybody else at this time period.